Welcome to the Funnel Effect.
Thank you. It is great to be here for this one.
Yeah, today we are doing something a bit special. We are not just reviewing a typical paper, we are analyzing a genuine landmark event in the history of cardiology.
Absolutely. It is one of those studies that basically divides medical history into a before and an after.
Exactly. So for our deep dive today, we are looking at the primary source titled Ezetimibe, added to statin therapy after acute coronary syndromes, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine on June 18, 2015.
And just to set the stage for you listening, that is a massive deal. The New England Journal is the pinnacle.
It really is. Now, in the world of medical research, credibility is your currency, right?
Yeah.
So before we even look at a single data point or hazard ratio, I need to establish exactly who is behind this massive undertaking.
Go for it. It is quite the list.
Yeah, bear with me, because the list of authors is essentially a who's who of cardiovascular medicine. The authors listed on this paper are Christopher P. Cannon, MD, Michael A. Blazing, MD, Robert P. Giuliano, MD, Amy McCagg, BS, Jennifer A. White, MS, Pierre Theroux, MD, Harold Darius, MD, Basil S. Lewis, MD, Tanuduo Fuis, MD, PhD, J. Water Jukima, MD, PhD, Gaetano M. De Ferrari, MD, Witold Ruzillo, MD, Paul DeLuca, PhD, Kinga M. PhD, Aaron A. Bahula, MD, DPhil, Craig Rice, PhD, Stephen D. Wiviet, MD, Andrew M. Tershikovic, MD, MPH, Thomas A. Musliner, MD, Eugene Braunwald, MD, and Robert M. Califf, MD.
Wow.
And this entire group is collectively known as the Improvite investigators.
It is, frankly, an incredibly intimidating lineup.
Yeah.
You have people under like Eugene Braunwald, who's very often considered the father of modern cardiology,
Wow.
and then Rob Califf, who has actually served as the commissioner of the FDA.
Yeah.
So when you see a roster like that, combined with the NEJM, you aren't just reading a standard study. You are reading a document that was designed from the ground up to settle a medical bet that had been running for literally decades.
That is the perfect setup. Let's talk about this bet. We need to set the stage for you. We are talking about heart disease, specifically in the context of cholesterol management. So if we rewind the clock to, say, roughly 2014 or 2015, right before this paper dropped, what was the status quo? What exactly was this statin era that everyone always talks about?
Well, to really understand the weight of this paper, you have to understand the sheer dominance of statin drugs. I mean, since the late 1980s, and especially accelerating through the 90s, the medical community had basically fallen in love with statins.
And for good reason, right?
Oh, for very good reason. We had trial after trial landmark studies like the 4S trial, the heart protection study, and they all showed a very, very clear pattern.
Which was what exactly?
You give a patient a statin, their cholesterol goes down, and their risk of dying or having a massive heart attack goes down. It was a beautiful, predictable straight line.
It became almost Pavlovian for doctors, didn't it? Like, see a heart patient, prescribe a statin.
Exactly. It became the absolute cornerstone of cardiovascular therapy. And we understood the mechanism incredibly well, too.
Let's break that mechanism down for a second, just to ground the conversation.
Sure. So statins are formerly known as HMG-CoA reductase inhibitors. That is obviously a mouthful. But essentially, they go into the liver and they turn off the specific enzyme responsible for synthesizing cholesterol.
So they're basically shutting down the manufacturing plant.
Right. It is exactly like turning off the main water faucet at a factory. Your liver makes less cholesterol. And the running dogma at the time was simply, intensive is better. We knew from the data that high-dose statins worked better than low-dose statins.
Because they drove the LDL, the bad cholesterol, even lower?
Yes. But, and there is always a but, in these historical medical stories, it was not a perfect solution. People were still getting sick.
Right. And that is the core problem here. We call it residual risk.
Exactly. Residual risk is the enemy. Even on high-dose statins, even with their LDL seemingly well-controlled on a lab report, patients were still coming back to the emergency room with recurrent heart attacks and recurrent strokes.
The statins were doing a lot of heavy lifting, but they just weren't catching everything.
No, they weren't. And on the flip side of that coin, you have the very real issue of tolerability. Not everyone can actually handle a high-dose statin.
The side effects.
Right. They get severe muscle aches, their liver enzymes start to spike dangerously, or they just feel generally unwell, like a severe fatigue. So doctors were stuck. They had essentially hit a ceiling with what statin therapy could achieve.
And that reality leads us directly to the mission of the Improvite trial. The medical community was stuck with this burning question. If we lower cholesterol using a completely non-statin drug and we add it to a statin, does it actually help the patients?
Yes, that was the million-dollar question.
Because the fear was, does it just make the numbers on the lab report look pretty without actually saving any lives?
That distinction is vital to keep in mind as we go through this.
Yeah.
In medicine, we call it treating the number versus treating the patient. You see, there was this real pervasive fear back then that maybe statins were sort of magic.
Magic in what sense?
Magic in that they did something special beyond just lowering the cholesterol. Maybe they reduced inflammation directly, or maybe they stabilized the plaque in the arteries in some unique proprietary way.
Ah, I see. So if that magic theory was true, then lowering cholesterol with a completely different drug might not actually prevent heart attacks at all.
Precisely. You might fix the blood test, but the patient still dies.
So enter the challenger drug for this deep dive, ezetimibe. Let's unpack this specific drug. How is ezetimibe different from a statin? Because you mentioned earlier that statins work by shutting down the factory in the liver.
Right. If statins are shutting down the factory, ezetimibe is blocking the supply chain, it works in the gut, not the liver.
Okay, how does that work mechanically?
Specifically, it targets a protein called the Niemann-Pick C1-like 1 protein. We usually just call it NPC1L1.
NPC1L1. Got it.
This protein sits right in the lining of your small intestine, and it acts exactly like a gatekeeper. Its entire job is to grab cholesterol from the food you just ate, and also the cholesterol that your liver naturally dumps into your bile, and usher all of that cholesterol across the gut wall and into your bloodstream.
So it is quite literally the doorman for cholesterol trying to enter the body.
That is the perfect analogy. It is the doorman. And ezetimibe simply locks that door. It inhibits the NPC1L1 protein, drastically reducing the absorption of cholesterol from the intestine.
So the overarching goal of the improving study was to see if a two-pronged attack shutting off the factory with simvastatin and simultaneously locking the delivery door with ezetimibe was actually better than just shutting off the factory alone.
Yes. And importantly, they weren't testing this theory on, healthy 30-year-old joggers or people with just mildly elevated numbers.
No, they went looking for trouble. They went for the highest risk group they could practically find.
Exactly. They specifically recruited patients with acute coronary syndromes, or ACS.
And for you listening, how do we define ACS in the context of this study?
In this trial, ACS was defined as having been hospitalized for a heart attack, either an acute myocardial infarction or high-risk unstable angina within the preceding 10 days.
Within 10 days?
Yes. These are people standing right on the edge of a cliff. Their arteries are highly unstable, they have active inflammation, and their risk of having a second repeat event is incredibly high. If your new drug combination is actually going to work, this is the exact arena where you want to prove it.
All right, let's move into section 1 of our deep dive, the setup. I really want to emphasize the sheer scale of this trial because it speaks directly to why the medical world trusts this data so implicitly. We aren't talking about a small pilot study at a local university hospital here.
No, definitely not. This is what we refer to in the business as a mega trial. It was a massive global undertaking. They ultimately enrolled 18,144 patients.
18,144 people. That is literally the population of a small city.
It is staggering. And just to physically get that number of qualified patients, they had to activate 11,147 clinical sites across 39 different countries.
I can't even imagine the logistics of that.
Think about it for a second. You are dealing with dozens of different languages, entirely different regulatory bodies, different local standards of medical care, and vastly different patient genetics and populations.
Just standardizing the data entry must have been a nightmare.
To coordinate reliable data collection across 39 countries is a Herculean task. And the duration of the study was equally impressive. The median follow-up time for these patients was 6 years.
6 years. Now, most studies we look at on this show are maybe 12 months, maybe 24 months if they are ambitious. Why commit to going for 6 full years?
Because cardiovascular disease is a chronic, slow-burning fire. If you only look at a patient for 1 year after a heart attack, you might completely miss the long-term benefits of the drug.
Or the long-term risks, right?
Exactly, or the risks. Keeping meticulous track of 18,000 people for 6 straight years ensures that the data you eventually publish is robust and highly durable. It effectively filters out the statistical noise.
Now, let's look at the actual patient profile a bit more closely. We already established they literally just had a heart attack. How old were they generally?
The average age was around 64 years old. They had to be at least 50 to enroll. But here is the really interesting part, and it is a crucial detail. They had relatively controlled LDL levels to start with.
Wait, really? I would assume they had sky-high cholesterol.
No, to even get into the study, their LDL had to be between 50 and 125 milligrams per deciliter, depending on whether they were already on some form of medication.
That is fascinating. So they weren't aggressively recruiting people with familial hypercholesterolemia walking around with an LDL of 300 or 400.
Not at all.
These were people with what a standard physical might call average or even good cholesterol numbers who still somehow managed to have a massive heart attack.
It's exactly right. And it forces a really uncomfortable question for the medical establishment. Is good enough actually good enough?
Yeah.
Because if your LDL is 90 and your doctor says that's fine, but you just had a heart attack, clearly an LDL of 90 wasn't safe for you personally.
Wow. Okay, so let's talk about the two arms of the trial, the battle of the regimens. How did they divide these 18,000 people?
It was a classic, randomized, double-blind setup, which means neither the treating doctors nor the patients had any idea who was getting the real ezetimibe and who was getting a sugar pill.
The gold standard.
Right. So Group A, which we call the monotherapy group, receives simvastatin 40 milligrams plus a daily placebo pill. Group B, the combination group, receives simvastatin 40 milligrams plus the active ezetimibe 10 milligrams.
Okay, I have to pause you right there on the simvastatin dose. 40 milligrams. I know for a fact that a lot of you listening right now who are on statins might be thinking, wait a minute, my doctor has me on a torvastatin 80 milligrams, or I take rosuvastatin 40 milligrams.
The real heavy hitters.
Exactly. Those are the big guns today. So why on earth did the Improvite investigators choose a moderate dose of simvastatin for such incredibly sick patients?
That is a very sharp observation, and it actually reflects the fascinating historical context of exactly when this study was designed and executed. When Improvite initially started enrolling patients, simvastatin 40 milligrams was a very standard, highly respectable, moderate-intensity statin therapy.
So it was normal for the time.
Yes. And the original study design actually allowed the doctors to bump the simvastatin dose up to 80 milligrams if the patient's LDL remained stubbornly higher than 79. They genuinely wanted to treat these patients to a specific target.
But something happened.
Yes. Here is where the real-world drama comes in. During the actual course of the 6-year study, the FDA released brand new urgent safety guidelines specifically restricting the use of simvastatin 80 milligrams across the board.
Because of side effects, let me guess, the muscles.
You got it. Specifically, muscle toxicity. A different trial had shown that simvastatin 80 milligrams had an unacceptably high rate of causing severe muscle damage. So the Improvite researchers were effectively handcuffed by the FDA halfway through their trial.
They weren't legally allowed to push the statin dose higher.
Exactly. For safety reasons, they had to stop up titrating. So the vast majority of the 18,000 patients stayed locked at the 40 milligram dose. But ironically, in a way, this was a happy accident for the purity of the science.
How so?
Because they couldn't randomly max out the statin dose for different people, it allowed them to perfectly isolate the specific effect of the ezetimibe. It became an incredibly pure, controlled test of moderate statin versus moderate statin plus ezetimibe.
That makes perfect sense. It freezes the background variable. Now, in any game, you need to know exactly how to keep score. What were the endpoints for Improvite? What actually counts as a win or a loss in this massive undertaking?
Well, in cardiology trials of this magnitude, we rarely ever look at just one single event like only death.
Because heart disease is complicated.
Right? It manifests in many different ways. A patient might not die, but they might have a terrible stroke. So they used what we call a primary composite endpoint.
A composite, so a bucket of bad things.
Exactly. Think of it as a bucket that catches 5 specific, distinct bad outcomes. If a patient experienced any one of these 5 things during the 6 years, it counted as a primary event.
Run through the list for us.
Okay. The 5 components were, number 1, cardiovascular death. Number 2, a non-fatal myocardial infarction, so surviving a heart attack. Number 3, unstable angina requiring rehospitalization.
So severe chest pain that puts you back in a hospital bed.
Right. Number 4 was coronary revascularization, meaning the patient needed a new stent put in or a full bypass surgery, and this had to occur at least 30 days after they were randomized to avoid counting the initial procedure. And finally, number 5, a non-fatal stroke.
Okay, so death, surviving a heart attack, severe chest pain requiring admission, needing a stent, or having a stroke. That pretty much covers the entire spectrum of really bad days for a heart patient.
It does. And statistically, grouping them all together into a composite gives this study much more statistical power to confidently detect a real difference between the two drugs.
All right, that sets the stage beautifully. Let's move to section 2, the biological impact. Because before we talk about whether the drug combo actually saved lives, we need to know if the drug physically did its physiological job.
Did it actually lower the cholesterol?
Exactly. Did ezetimibe actually move the needle on the blood work?
It didn't just move the needle, it absolutely crushed the numbers. This is where that mechanism of action we discussed, literally blocking the gut from absorbing cholesterol, really proves itself in the real world.
Give us the numbers.
Okay, remember, both groups started with a baseline LDL of around 93.8 milligrams per deciliter.
Which, as we said, historically speaking, is not terrible. It is under 100.
It is decent. Now look at the monotherapy group. These are the folks taking just the simvastatin 40 milligram. Over the course of the study, their LDL dropped to a time-weighted average of 69.5.
69.5. So that is a very solid, respectable result. It actually perfectly hits the clinical guidelines of that era, which generally told doctors to get their high-risk patients slightly below 70.
They did a good job. The placebo group received genuinely good standard of care medicine. But then you look at the combination group.
The simvastatin plus ezetimibe group,
Yes, their LDL dropped to a time-weighted average of 53.7.
53.7. That is exceptionally low for a massive population average.
Is profound. That is a raw difference of roughly 16 or 17 points compared to the statin-only group. To put it in percentages, essentially adding the ezetimibe pill provided an additional 24% lowering of LDL on top of what the statin was already doing on its own.
That is wild. That is a quarter of the remaining bad cholesterol just entirely wiped out of the bloodstream.
Yes. And the consistency across the thousands of patients was remarkable. It wasn't just a handful of super responders artificially dragging the mathematical average down. The entire bell curve shifted to the left.
That is powerful.
And it wasn't just LDL either. When you look at the other lipid biomarkers in the blood, the picture is perfectly consistent. Total cholesterol was significantly lower. Triglycerides were lower. And importantly, high-sensitivity C-reactive protein, or hsCRP, was significantly lower in the combo group.
I really want to highlight that CRP finding because CRP is a primary marker for systemic inflammation, right?
Exactly correct. And we know today that atherosclerosis, the actual buildup of the deadly plaque in your arteries, it isn't just a simple plumbing problem of grease clogging a dumb pipe.
Right, it's an active disease.
It is an active, aggressive, inflammatory disease. Think of it more like a really angry, inflamed pimple growing on the inside wall of your artery. Inflammation is what makes that plaque chemically unstable and highly likely to suddenly rupture. And that rupture is what causes the fatal blood clot and the heart attack.
So seeing that the CRP dropped alongside the LDL is a very, very positive signal.
It is huge. It suggests we aren't just passively filtering the blood of grease, we are actively cooling down the entire systemic disease process. In fact, significantly more people in the combination group hit what they called a dual goal of having both an LDL strictly less than 70 and low inflammation markers compared to the statin-only group.
So biochemically speaking, the combination drug is an absolute powerhouse. It tanks the bad numbers. But, and here is where the rubber meets the road for you listening, treating a spreadsheet is not the same thing as treating a human being.
No, it is not.
We don't want to just make the lab report look pretty. We want to keep people alive and out of the emergency room.
Precisely. That is the fundamental difference between what researchers call a surrogate endpoint, like your LDL level, and a hard clinical outcome. Medical history is absolutely littered with failed drugs that successfully lowered a number on a test but didn't help or actually actively hurt the patient.
Right. So that brings us to section 3, the clinical outcomes. Did it actually save hearts? What was the final headline result after 6 years of tracking 18,000 people?
The overarching headline is, it was a clinical success. The trial officially met its primary composite endpoint. But we really need to dig into the nuance of the actual percentages because they tell a very specific, somewhat sobering story about the limits of modern medicine.
Let's hear the raw stats.
When they looked at the final event rate at the 7-year mark, 34.7% of the patients in the simvastatin-only group had experienced at least one of those 5 bad events we listed earlier.
Let's just pause there for a second and let that sink in. 34.7%. That means roughly 1 in 3 people, despite being strictly compliant on a statin and receiving excellent modern medical care, still had a major life-altering cardiac event within 7 years.
Yeah.
That really highlights just how incredibly dangerous and relentless this condition is once you have that first heart attack.
It is a deeply sobering statistic for any cardiologist. It shows exactly why we simply cannot afford to be complacent. Now, let's look at the intervention arm. In the simvastatin plus ezetimibe group, that event rate was 32.7%.
Okay, so 34.7% for the control versus 32.7% for the combo drug.
Right. Which gives us an absolute risk reduction of exactly 2.2 percentage points. The overall hazard ratio was 0.936, which translates roughly to a 6.4% relative risk reduction.
And the statistical significance.
The p-value was 0.016, which means it formally crossed the threshold for statistical significance. It was a real effect, not chance.
Okay, I have to play the skeptic here on behalf of the listener. 2%, an absolute reduction of just 2%. That really doesn't sound like a massive number. If I told you I could reduce the price of your new house by 2%, you wouldn't exactly be throwing a parade. Is a 2% drop actually clinically meaningful?
It is a completely fair critique, and believe me, it was debated heavily in the medical journals when this paper first dropped. But you have to contextualize what 2% actually means here.
Okay, provide the context.
First, you have to apply that 2% to the global population level. Heart disease is the undisputed #1 killer globally. There are tens of millions of people walking around with ACS. A 2% absolute reduction across that population translates to preventing hundreds of thousands of heart attacks and strokes every single year.
So from a macro public health perspective, that is a massive amount of human suffering and hospital cost prevented?
Exactly. It is a huge public health win. And secondly, you have to look at what they were actually up against. These patients were not untreated. They were already on the absolute best medical therapy available.
Right, they were already being heavily medicated.
They were on daily aspirin, beta blockers, ACE inhibitors, and statins. Improving on the modern standard of care is exponentially harder than improving on nothing at all.
I see.
It's kind of like Formula One racing. When you are building a consumer car, adding 20 miles an hour is easy. But when your F1 car is already going 200 miles an hour, finding the engineering to add just an extra 2 miles an hour is incredibly difficult and expensive. This is what we call fighting for an incremental benefit.
That is a great analogy. We are literally fighting for inches here because the baseline care is already so good.
Exactly. And when we break down exactly which specific events inside that composite bucket were actually prevented, the clinical data becomes even more compelling.
Break it down for us.
The overall reduction wasn't just driven by soft, subjective endpoints like unstable angina requiring rehospitalization. The drug combination significantly lowered the hard rate of actual myocardial infarction.
Heart attacks.
Yes, the rate of new heart attacks dropped from 14.8% down to 13.1%.
That's substantial because preventing a full-blown heart attack physically preserves heart muscle from dying.
Exactly. It prevents heart failure down the line. And then look at ischemic stroke, the strokes caused by blood clots in the brain. The rate dropped from 4.1% to 3.4%. That is a highly statistically significant reduction in stroke risk.
I think most people, if you really ask them, fear severe disabling stroke almost more than they fear sudden death. To prevent a stroke is to literally save a person's independence and their mind.
Absolutely. It is arguably the most devastating outcome. Now, speaking of death, we do have to address the mortality data head on. Did the people on ezetimibe actually live longer?
Yes, was there a definitive survival benefit?
The plain answer is no. There was no statistically significant difference in death from any cause, or specifically cardiovascular death. The survival curves for the two groups over the 6 years were basically stacked right on top of each other.
Okay, so let me summarize that. Fewer heart attacks, significantly fewer strokes, but the exact same number of overall deaths. How do we as an audience interpret that seemingly contradictory outcome?
It is not contradictory when you realize it reflects the sheer brilliance of modern acute medical care. We have become very, very good at keeping people alive immediately after they have a heart attack.
Right.
If you have an event today, the modern ambulance gets you to the specialized cath lab in 20 minutes. They deploy a balloon and put in a stent, and you survive. So moving the needle on raw mortality is incredibly difficult in modern trials because the background survival rate for the immediate event is so remarkably high. But preventing the morbidity, preventing the severe physical trauma of the heart attack, preventing the progressive heart failure that slowly ruins your life afterward, preserving your daily quality of life, that is where the true value of this drug lies. Just because the drug didn't technically alter the final death rate doesn't mean it didn't profoundly change the actual life of the patient.
That is a really key insight. It is fundamentally about living well and preserving function, not just technically staying alive on a monitor.
Precisely.
So we know the overall averages. Did this combination work equally well for everyone? Or were there specific subgroups of people who saw significantly more benefit?
The benefit was impressively consistent across almost all the standard subgroups they analyzed. It worked for men, women, active smokers, non-smokers.
Hmm.
But two specific groups really stood out with particularly pronounced clinical benefits.
Who are they?
First, patients with pre-existing diabetes mellitus. They saw a significantly greater absolute risk reduction than the non-diabetic patients.
Which logically makes perfect sense. Diabetics have that severe metabolic chaos going on. Their blood vessels are under constant stress, so aggressive lipid-lowering yields uniquely high returns for them.
Yes, their baseline risk is higher, so they have more to gain. And the second standout group was the elderly, specifically patients who were 75 years or older at the time of the trial.
Really? That is interesting.
It is, because it directly challenges a very common hesitation that working doctors often have. Often in the clinic, a doctor might think, oh, this patient is 78, they're frail, maybe we shouldn't be too aggressive with piling on all these potent drugs.
Right, you don't want to over-medicate an older person.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the improvement data strongly suggests the exact opposite approach for this specific condition. The elderly are at the absolute highest baseline risk for a fatal repeat event, so mathematically, they actually have the most absolute benefit to gain from this aggressive combination therapy.
Fascinating. So let's recap where we are. We have a drug combination that absolutely tanks the LDL numbers safely, significantly cuts the rate of new heart attacks and strokes, and works particularly well in high-risk diabetics and the elderly.
Sounds perfect.
It does sound perfect, but there is absolutely no free lunch in human biology. If you push a complex physiological system that hard, something usually breaks.
We have to talk about Section 4, safety and side effects.
We definitely do. Whenever you deliberately push blood cholesterol this low, or you start stacking a second systemic drug onto a statin, the primary fear in the medical community is toxicity. And honestly, ezetimibe came into this trial with some pretty heavy baggage.
What were the specific historical concerns with this drug?
Well, the big three fears for any lipid-lowering drugs are usually damage to the liver, severe damage to the muscles, and specifically for ezetimibe due to some prior statistical noise cancer.
Wait, cancer, stop right there. I feel like that is a side effect that would instantly stop any patient in their tracks. Why was cancer even on the table? Yes, it is incredibly important to address this history. There was a previous, much smaller clinical study conducted years earlier called the SEAS trial.
SEAS.
Right. In that specific trial, there was a really weird, highly unexpected statistical signal where the patients taking ezetimibe seemed to have a higher rate of newly diagnosed cancer.
That is terrifying.
It is. Now, it was never proven to be causal, and most rigorous statistical experts looked at it and thought it was just a random fluke. Basically just bad luck in the random number generator for years, like a dark cloud.
Because you can't just ignore a cancer signal.
Exactly. People were genuinely worried that artificially blocking cholesterol absorption in the gut might somehow negatively affect normal cell growth or impair the immune system's natural surveillance against tumors.
Okay, so that is a massive concern. And then, of course, you have the classic statin fear, muscle damage.
Correct. The medical term is rhabdomyolysis. That is a condition of severe, rapid muscle breakdown that releases proteins into the blood that can permanently damage the kidneys. It is the absolute worst-case scenario side effect everyone prescribing a statin is terrified of.
So IMPROVE-IT wasn't just a trial to see if the drug worked.
No, IMPROVE-IT was functionally a massive 6-year global safety audit. And honestly, the results they published were remarkably, unequivocally reassuring.
Give us the good news then.
First, let's look at the liver toxicity. They monitored liver enzymes, specifically ALT and AST. There was absolutely zero significant difference between the monotherapy group and the combination group. The addition of the drug simply did not chew up the liver.
Good. What about the muscles?
Second, the muscle problems. Again, there was no significant difference in the rates of myopathy or rhabdomyolysis. Stacking ezetimibe on top of the simvastatin did not magically make the muscles more sensitive or prone to breaking down.
And the big one, the big C. Did IMPROVE-IT finally clear its name regarding the SEAS trial?
This was arguably the single most important safety finding of the entire decade for this drug class. There was absolutely no significant difference in new, relapsing, or worsening cancer.
Wow.
The event rates were almost mathematically identical between the placebo group and the ezetimibe group over 6 entire years. This definitive study, with 18,000 real-world patients, effectively killed the ezetimibe causes cancer myth permanently. It proved the drug's long-term safety profile once and for all.
That has to be a huge relief for anyone currently taking this medication. It really shows the irreplaceable value of these long-term, large-scale studies. You just can't simulate 18,000 human lives in a computer model and get that kind of certainty.
Exactly. You need the grueling, expensive real-world data to silence the doubts.
What about the gallbladder? Just logically thinking about it, since ezetimibe actively alters cholesterol absorption and bile flow in the gut, does it cause a spike in gallstones or gallbladder disease?
It is a very logical physiological hypothesis, and they checked for it, but the data showed zero difference in gallbladder-related events between the two groups.
Okay, so liver is fine, muscles are fine, no cancer, no gallstones. Was there literally anything concerning? Any red flags hidden in the supplementary appendix at all?
There was one very small signal, but we have to be incredibly careful not to overinterpret it statistically. There was a slight, non-significant increase in the rate of hemorrhagic stroke in the combination group.
Hemorrhagic meaning a physical bleed in the brain as opposed to a clot.
Correct. The rate was 0.8% in the combination group versus 0.6% in the monotherapy group.
0.8 versus 0.6. I mean, that is tiny.
It is tiny. And the calculated p-value for that specific difference was 0.11.
Which means it did not cross the threshold for statistical significance.
Right. It means there is a very high probability it was just random chance. And importantly, even if you assume it is real, that tiny fractional increase was vastly, overwhelmingly outweighed by the massive significant reduction in ischemic strokes, which are the ones caused by clots.
So the net overall benefit on brain health was still overwhelmingly positive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But, basic scientific honesty requires us to openly report every single signal, no matter how small or insignificant it appears.
Of course. So, the safety profile looks undeniably excellent. The efficacy data is completely solid. The combination works. Now we arrive at section 5 of our deep dive, the why and the so what. Because this is where we get a bit philosophical. This paper didn't just get a new pill approved by the FDA. It fundamentally settled a civil war in the cardiology community.
So this is genuinely my favorite part of the whole story. This is where we zoom out and connect the specific data points to the bigger picture of how we understand human biology.
You teased the LDL hypothesis versus the statin hypothesis earlier in the show. Can we really dig into that now? Because for a long, long time, people genuinely thought statins were functionally unique.
Yes, they did. For nearly 20 solid years, the primary argument in academic medicine went exactly like this. We know for a fact statins reliably reduce heart attacks. We also know statins predictably lower LDL cholesterol. But maybe they reduce the heart attacks, actually, because they reduce systemic inflammation, or they chemically stabilize the plaque, or they improve the endothelial function of the blood vessels. And the LDL lowering is basically just a convenient side effect.
Right.
That entire school of thought was called the statin hypothesis.
Essentially, the theory was statins are these complex magic potions, and we don't fully understand all the ways they work, but they're the only things that definitively work.
Exactly. The strongly opposing view was the LDL hypothesis. And that group argued, no, LDL cholesterol is the primary driver of the disease. It is the toxic particle. If you lower the LDL level in the blood by absolutely any means necessary, whether that is a statin, an extreme diet, a gastric bypass surgery, or a totally different class of drug, you will predictably reduce the cardiovascular risk.
So the IMPROVE-IT trial was essentially the ultimate high-stakes tiebreaker between these two massive theories.
It was the definitive, undeniable test. This was the very first major, adequately powered trial in history to definitively show that a completely non-statin drug, which lowers LDL through a totally different mechanism, acting in the gut instead of the liver, produced a hard cardiovascular benefit when added to a statin.
Wow.
Because ezetimibe absolutely does not have any of those theoretical magic pleiotropic properties that statins have. It just blocks absorption. It just lowers the LDL.
So the logic is, if the magic potion statin theory was actually the correct one, ezetimibe shouldn't have worked at all. It should have just lowered the lab number, but had zero effect on the actual rate of heart attack.
Precisely. It would have been a cosmetic fix.
Right.
But it did objectively reduce the hard rate of heart attacks. So it definitively proved to the world that it is not just the magic of the statin molecule. It is the physical lowering of the LDL particles in the blood. It completely validated the LDL hypothesis.
And what's even more fascinating to me is that the actual clinical benefit they saw matched the theoretical math almost perfectly, right?
It did. It was beautiful. There's a very famous graph in cardiology called a CTT meta-analysis plot.
The CTT plot.
Yes, it essentially draws a straight, predictable diagonal line showing that for every specific unit of LDL you physically remove from the patient's blood, you get a highly specific, mathematically predictable reduction in clinical risk. When the IMPROVE-I data was finalized, the ezetimibe result landed exactly, perfectly right on that pre-existing line.
That is incredible. It makes biology look almost like physics, like action and reaction. You systematically lower the bad stuff, and the risk drops proportionally, completely, regardless of the specific mechanical tool you use to do it.
Exactly. It irreversibly solidified the clinical idea that doctors should relentlessly focus on the number, drive the LDL down.
And speaking of driving it down, let's talk about the concept of the floor. Just how low can you safely go?
This was the other massive paradigm shift triggered by this single paper. Before this study was published, the major clinical guidelines generally told doctors, get the patient's LDL below 70.
Right, 70 was the magic finish line.
Exactly. Once a high-risk patient hit an LDL of 68 or 65, doctors would basically high-five the patient in the clinic and say, we are done. Goal achieved. Keep taking your meds.
Checking the box and moving on.
But in the IMPROVE-IT trial, remember, the combination group got down to an average of 53 milli-GDL. And remember that 53 is just the mathematical average.
Right, which implies half the people were lower.
Yes. Many thousands of patients in that group were cruising along at much lower levels, down in the 30s or even the 40s.
Yeah.
And the study undeniably showed that going below that magical 70 provided tangible extra clinical benefit.
So 53 is objectively better than 70.
Yes, it is. It forcibly introduced the concept to the mainstream that lower is better. And truthfully, even today, we haven't really found the absolute physiological floor where the benefit completely stops.
Really? Is there no bottom?
Physiologically speaking, if you think about a newborn human baby, we are naturally born with circulating LDL levels around 30 or 40. That is the baseline level, what our human bodies are biologically designed to function at. This massive study showed that aggressively returning to those low, natural physiological levels using modern drugs safely reduces risk in adults with advanced heart disease.
That completely changes the everyday conversation in the doctor's office. Instead of the doctor looking at the chart and saying, you're at 68, you're good, the doctor should now be saying, you're at 68, which is okay, but let's see if we can safely get you down to 50.
Exactly. It literally shifted the global goalpost. It moved the entire field of cardiology from a lazy strategy of just prescribe a high-intensity statin and hope for the best to a highly active strategy of treat the patient until you hit a specific biological target.
Okay, now, we do have to be completely balanced here. We are doing a deep dive, not a commercial. What are the genuine limitations of this study? Why isn't every single person with high cholesterol on this specific combination pill immediately?
Well, the most common critique, and we touched on this earlier, is regarding the use of the moderate simvastatin dose in the control arm.
Because of the FDA rule.
Right. Critics have actively argued that if the researchers had been allowed to compare the simvastatin plus ezetimibe combination against a truly modern high-dose statin like atorvastatin 80 milligram or rosuvastatin 40 milligram, the clinical difference between the two groups might have been significantly smaller.
Because the high-dose statin would have successfully driven the LDL much lower all on its own, leaving less room for the ezetimibe to show off.
Exactly. The gap would have narrowed. But to defend the paper, the underlying biological principle still clearly holds true. Mathematically lowering LDL adds incremental benefit. The other major limitation we must acknowledge is the high discontinuation rate.
Oh, how high was it?
By the end of the trial, roughly 42% of the enrolled patients had actually stopped taking their assigned study drug prematurely.
42%. That is almost half the people. Why would they stop? Was it side effects?
It sounds incredibly high to a layperson, but it is actually very typical for these massive long-term global studies that drag on for 6 or 7 years.
Why is that?
Life happens. People physically move away from the clinic. They simply get tired of taking daily pills, what we clinically call pill fatigue, or they develop completely unrelated severe health issues like a different cancer and dropout. But it does serve to forcefully remind us that adherence is truly the hardest part of modern medicine.
A miracle drug only actually works if the patient swallows it every day.
Exactly. The greatest drug in the world has an efficacy of 0 if it stays in the bottle.
That is very true. And lastly, we need to remember the specific population they tested.
Right, a crucial point. This data was strictly derived from ACS patients, people who had literally just had a heart attack, We cannot automatically scientifically extrapolate this exact 2% benefit to someone who just has slightly high cholesterol but has never actually had a heart attack.
Because that is primary prevention.
Correct. This trial is exclusively secondary prevention data.
So we are rapidly coming to the end of our deep dive today. Let's try to synthesize the key takeaways for you listening. If you're walking away from this analysis, what are the core nuggets of information you absolutely need to hold on to?
I would summarize it by saying there are 4 main pillars from this paper.
Okay, let's hear them.
Number 1, adding ezetimibe to a baseline statin isn't just a cosmetic change to make your lab results look pretty. It physically lowers your LDL cholesterol by a solid, highly predictable additional 24%. It fundamentally works.
Got it.
Number 2, that specific biological change actually translates to a harsh clinical reality. It significantly reduces the absolute risk of devastating heart attacks and ischemic strokes in patients who have recently suffered an acute coronary syndrome.
Pillar 3.
Number 3, the safety profile of this approach is excellent. The lingering historical fears about ezetimibe causing cancer or exacerbating severe muscle damage were completely statistically put to rest by this massive 6-year data set.
And the final pillar.
And number 4, and perhaps conceptually most importantly for the future, lower is better. Pushing your LDL actively down to 53 mg/dL or even lower is not only biologically safe, it is clinically beneficial.
That is a remarkably powerful summary. It really does feel like this single study was the pivot point for an entire medical field.
Yeah.
It took us away from the era of just take this brand name pill and moved us into the modern era of we must hit this specific biological target.
It absolutely did. And honestly, that leads directly to my final thought on where this data ultimately takes us.
Let's hear it. What is the final provocative thought for the listener to mull over tonight?
If we try to connect this specific paper to the much bigger picture of human health, IMPROVE-IT didn't just validate one drug, ezetimibe.
What did it do?
It essentially kicked open the door for the entire next generation of advanced therapies. By finally definitively proving that non-statin LDL lowering actually works to save lives, it laid out the red carpet for the incredibly powerful PCSK9 inhibitor injections and the other novel genetic drugs we see dominating the field today.
It changed the philosophy.
It shifted the entire focus of the pharmaceutical industry from prescribing a specific proprietary drug class to achieving a specific biological target by any means necessary. It unequivocally proves that your underlying biology, the actual LDL particle number itself, matters so much more than the pharmacology or the marketing brand of the pill you swallow.
That is a profound way to look at it. It is not about trusting the tool. It is about demanding the result. And it really empowers you, the patient, to look at your own lab numbers and actively ask your doctor, am I actually at the best possible number for my personal biology, or are we just settling?
Exactly. It completely invites you to take aggressive ownership of your own physiological data.
Well, on that highly empowering note, we hope this deep dive has lowered your confusion and significantly raised your understanding of this landmark paper.
It has been a pleasure going through it.
Thank you for watching The Funnel Effect.